I'm not going to get into the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, completely misnamed act. I've written editorials about it. It's a disaster law, and it's going to destroy the practice of medicine. That's not my purpose here today, but what this book does, this book is a book of quotes that lead to economic liberty, that lead to leadership, that lead to freedom. And the whole reason that I decided to write a book, my wonderful wife Robin and I, she's a healthcare lawyer, we had some bad news called Hurricane Katrina. It destroyed our medical practice, a six-surgeon group in eastern New Orleans, destroyed the hospital. The hospital still hasn't opened up yet, and the patients were gone. And I went and bought a trailer and a Ford 250 truck, and I moved it into our driveway. And so for a year, we lived in that trailer. And I decided that all my notes I had on a Palm Pilot about leadership, I would write a book. And I said to Robin that this book, if nobody bought it, at least we would make sure that the grandkids would have it, so they would have some idea if Paw has a stroke or heart attack reading about the latest government intervention in the practice of medicine. And the book did well. It's in its second edition, with expanded with 2 additional chapters. And so this book is an attempt to put together a collection of economic ideas that lead to liberty. And there are many, some of the ones you've heard from the excellent talks today: John Stuart Mill, Thomas Paine, Milton Friedman, Hazlitt, Hayek. You'll find all of those. Dr. Orient's quote is in the book. And people who, when I served taking care of those pilots who were in Vietnam coming back, I was here in South Dakota, but they're very heroic people that serve our country and fight for liberty. And it always appeared very strange to me that we have people buried in graveyards around the world. I've had the opportunity to visit the Normandy graveyards and go to the Punch Bowl, the graveyard of the Pacific. And I always think of those people every time I see some politician destroying our liberty. And we have to remind people, in this book you'll see some symbols in there that remind people of the prices we paid for liberty. And so the main idea about leadership, people often ask me in interviews, well, what exactly is leadership? And I studied people in history, and I studied people who are still alive. I had the privilege to meet Bud Lamel. He's the man I talked about, he and Colonel Rudder, the heroic Rangers at Pointe du Hoc. And I admire them, I speak about them during my AMA tour of duty. I mention them in many speeches. And one day, my wife Robin and I, we support the World War II Museum, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And we had a friend who was a pilot in Vietnam. He was in town, so Robin gave her ticket to him, and he and I, we grew up together. Sandy Meyer, he was in town for that weekend. We went down there, and during the break, I saw a man in the bookstore. And I told my friend Sandy, I said, I'm pretty sure that's Bud Lamel. And he said, you think? And I said, yeah, I think so. So I walked up to him and I said, sir, are you Bud Lamel? And he said, yes, I'm Bud Lamel. And I said, may I take your picture? He said, only if you get in it with me. So that's how I got my picture taken with Bud Lamel. Now, who is Bud Lamel? Bud Lamel is a ranger who climbed Pointe du Hoc, and he had one mission. He was considered the 3rd most important man in the D-Day invasion. His mission was to destroy the 155mm cannons. That was his mission. The Germans were not stupid, and we had aerial photographs where those cannons were. Those cannons could knock out any ship in the fleet coming in at Normandy. And when he went there were telephone poles disguised as cannons. Well, Lamel, as part of a leader, he had courage by being a ranger, by being there, but he didn't give up. And he uncovered the ground a little bit, and he found some heavy tracks, and he had one man with him, Sergeant Kuhn, who was a sharpshooter. We call them snipers these days. And his mission was to keep Lamel alive at least until he could destroy the guns. Fortunately, they both lived. And he snuck up on these cannons with the Germans nearby and destroyed every one of the cannons using a silent grenade mechanism called thermite grenades. He fused the mechanisms. And what a guy. And I had the privilege, I think I have the most accurate description of what he did. The Longest Day got it wrong. A whole bunch of books got it wrong. But I had the privilege to meet with him. I asked him for his email address so I could communicate with him. And he said, I don't do that email stuff. He said, but I'll give you my phone number. You can call me night or day. So we became buds, and he just passed away this past year. A really heroic guy. So what are the elements of leadership? Homework, courage, decisiveness, action, persistence, and integrity. And if you go through history and study leaders, I'm talking about real leaders. I'm not talking about the Hitlers. I'm not talking about these totalitarian dictators that murder and lie. I'm not talking about them. Those are not real leaders. Those are thugs. I'm talking about real leaders. And so these elements are necessary for leadership in medicine. And this go along to get along is not going to get us to where we have to go. I noticed that the AAPS, your motto is all for the patient. I can guarantee you that PPACA is not all for the patient. It's for control, central control. And I tell people in debates, I've debated these single-payer people over the years. I've testified in Congress on this issue. And I challenge anyone to show me where price fixing has ever worked in the history of the world. Where has it ever worked? It's never worked in the history of the world. It always leads to loss of quality of care when you're dealing about medicine. But in general, it leads to loss of the product or loss of the service. That's the history of price fixing. So the title here is some tales from the little red book of leadership lessons. Some years ago, a man took hostages in a cottage in New Orleans. He had one hostage at the window with a gun pointed at the hostage's head. The police were called by neighbors and they surrounded the house. And then an unmarked police car came up. A man got out in plain clothes. He talked to the officers on the scene, and then he made a decision. He started walking toward the house. He walked on the lawn. The gunman watched him with great interest, and then the policeman stopped halfway up the lawn, took his coat off, and dropped it on the ground. And on his side, on his belt, was a standard issue police gun of the day, was a Smith & Wesson 6-shot revolver, 38, 4-inch barrel. He slowly took it out of his holster, and he laid it on the ground. He advanced toward the door. The door was unlocked. He went in. And when he did, the gunman took the gun from the hostage's head and put it in his face and said, "Now I'm going to kill you." And the policeman slowly raised his right hand, not to grab the gun, not to strike the guy, but he put his hand on the gunman's forehead and he said, "You have a fever." And the gunman was perplexed. He said, "What? I have a fever?" He says, "Yes, you have a fever, and I know the doctors at Charity Hospital. Let me take you there. They will help you." And with that, he moved his hand down on the gun and took the gun from the gunman. At that point, another policeman rushed in the door. He had observed the whole scene, and he grabbed the gunman and he said, "Major, don't worry, I'll take him to central lockup now." And the major said, "No, I promised the man I would take him to Charity Hospital. He needs help. Put him in my car. I'll take him personally." And he did. That man was my father, Major Dominic Palmisano. So he was my hero. And before that episode occurred, I wanted to quit Tulane Med School after the first exam that I failed, by the way. Someone told me in pre-med that you should take all these literature courses. You may want to be a writer one day. And don't take all those extra courses. And so I felt like I didn't know what was going on in that anatomy. And they always bust you out of Tulane in that anatomy course. And so I was very discouraged when I got that F. And I saw my dad one night. I waited for him to come home. He came home quite late from his police work. And my mom said, "Don't bother your dad when he's eating. It's best to wait till after he eats. You'll get a better reception." So I said, "Mom, this is so important." So I went to Dad and I said, "Dad," and he put that paper down. He was reading the newspaper. He says, "Yes, son." And he knew that I was aggravating him and irritating him. And I told him I wanted to quit. He said, "Son, don't quit medical school. He said, you'll do well in medical school, but you must remember 3 points. Do your homework, have courage, and don't give up. You do those 3 things, and very little in life is impossible. And I thought to myself, Dad never went to college, and he doesn't know anything about medical school. How does he know this, you know? But I followed his advice, and I did well after that. I changed my study habits, and I did extremely well. But I realized that what he told me was the rules for success. And by observing my dad, and then observing doctors that I admired as I went through school, I realized that there were other elements to leadership. And Dad would exhibit those elements in his own actions. His men, when my dad died, I gave a eulogy at his funeral. And I never knew exactly how he got the gun away from the man. He didn't talk about it. And a man came up to me and he said, Doctor, I'd like to tell you, you mentioned you didn't know how your dad got the gun away. He said, I was the guy who rushed in when your dad did take the gun away. I heard the whole conversation. And that's how I learned the story. And he said, the reason we believed in your dad was he was a man of integrity. And he would never tell us to do something that he wouldn't do himself. And that day he demonstrated it just as he had done many other times. And that's what you find. George Washington, if you want to read about the gold standard for leadership, read everything you can about George Washington. George Washington led his men in the troops, into battle, his troops. When you see him crossing the Delaware, they had lost battle after battle, and they went to Trenton for the first big victory. He's at the front of that boat in those paintings. Well, that's really what happened. That's what he did. George Washington. Now, sometimes you think that someone's not listening. I know you sometimes think that. But the goal is to continue, as the other speakers have said, you got to keep spreading the word. And you got to make sure the young medical students get the word too. Because people will tweet me and say, oh, well, there's hope for medicine. The young medical students are all in favor of the new health care law. That's wonderful. Well, those medical students are not getting the message. I teach a course at Tulane called Leadership in Medicine. And I say, look, I don't care whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, independent or whatever, but you ought to understand that people died giving you the right to vote, and you ought to go vote. But before you vote, you ought to do your homework. And you ought to understand what famous scientists have said in the past. You can have all these wonderful theories and so on, but don't try to force people to do it or say this is the only answer when you don't have the actual experimental proof. You got to do that. And so our challenge is the attack on the patient-physician relationship, the attempt of government to control, the action of government to coerce and treat physicians as pawns and patients as serfs who need control and direction from all-knowing bureaucrats who act under the direction of pandering politicians. In 1976, I had the privilege to represent the physicians in New Orleans, the Orleans Parish Medical Society, and testify before a congressional subcommittee, the Health Subcommittee of Ways and Means. A gentleman that some of you would be old enough to remember, his name is Roskentowski, and he was the chair of that Health Subcommittee. He got into a few problems later on, as sometimes politicians do. But you'll see that particular testimony, an excerpt from it, on page 208 of the book. And what I said was, we oppose a collectivist, socialistic medical system and advocate the free enterprise American system for many reasons. National health insurance costs more. The trusted doctor-patient relationship can only exist in a system where patients and doctors can have freedom of choice through the selection of each other. At the end, I said, I'd like to end by stating that in closing, I bring to the attention of those who have yet to treat a sick patient, but who desire to, quote, tinker with our medical system, the words of a physician written in the year 335 BC. And he said, we observe that persons of experience are actually more successful than those who possess theory without experience. The reason for this is that experience is acquainted with individual facts, but art with general rules, and all action and production is concerned with the individual. Hence, if one possesses the theory without the experience and is acquainted with the universal concept, but not with the individual facts contained under it, he will often go wrong in his treatment. For what has to be treated is the individual. The physician's son's name? Aristotle. I don't know if they paid attention to that. You had 5 minutes to talk, and I was a little upset being a novice. I said, I only get 5 minutes? And I realized that everybody gets 5 minutes. Today, you only get 5 minutes. The real fun comes in the Q&A. One time, I was involved in Q&A for 4 hours on privacy, patient privacy. I was speaking against the individual patient identifier, a complete way for somebody to quickly break in and get all of the information. I gave the example of the Central Intelligence Agency. You'll see that in the book too. One day, I always go to the Central Intelligence Agency website. Whenever you're going to go on a trip, it's a great place to go. They have all kind of data about the country, and it's open to the public. It's up-to-date data. And when I went there, it said Central Stupidity Agency. And I said, wow. So I quickly grabbed my camera and I took a picture of that, and 20 minutes later it was gone. But somebody had hacked into the CIA website and changed the name of it. And you'll see that particular picture. I was able to find it in my archives. To the perhaps dismay of the administrator of the hospital, when I was chief of the hospital medical staff in 1978, where I practiced, I said, have you not heard the voices of those administrators, doctors, or others who sell their intellectual birthrights of freedom and independence? The payment varies. Some get money, some get certainty, and some compromise regulatory lawsuits to avoid controversy and possible attention to their jobs. Because of their ever-changing chameleon-like characters and bankrupt philosophies with resulting low self-esteem, they fear that the spotlight will cause loss of their jobs. Not a few even opt for power to control you. Their rationalization is always the same. We have no choice. If we don't do it or join, it will be done to us without our participation. At least by obeying and joining, we have some input. Our funds will be cut off. Well, you saw what happened in the previous lectures in Nazi Germany, and you saw what that led to. Threat, coercion, fear of loss, submission, the pattern is monotonous. What these cowardly individuals fail to understand is that victory falls to the regulators when you sanction their actions. Do not forget that the power to tax involves the power to destroy. And was that some radical? That was Chief Justice Marshall, United States Supreme Court. When I left the presidency of the Louisiana State Medical Society in 1985, my talk was entitled, when I leave an organization, I like to say, rather than list what we did this year, just go ahead and read it in the handout. But I want to give you an attempt at a philosophical view of where we are and where we're heading. And I see I have 10 minutes, so I have my little alarm up here, so I thank you for that, because I don't want to go over. And AAPS published this in one of your pamphlets, and the Louisiana State Medical Society also published it. But I said the first inquiry, the sine qua non of the doctor-patient relationship in quality medicine is simply stated. Is this in the patient's best interest? The patient's welfare must be paramount. In my AMA inaugural address, and because of time constraints, I'm not going to go through those excerpts, but I talked about what has happened in the 50 years since I finished medical school. Heart transplants, gene therapy. I pointed out a doctor in the audience who was 17 years post-op liver transplant, a dear friend, an eloquent spokesperson for medicine. He's told me, he said, Donald, the day I got my transplant, I was dying and I knew I would die that day. The phone rang next to my bed. And before my family could answer it, I tried to reach it, and I was too weak to move my arm. I knew this was my last moment on earth. And then the call came. And there he is, a very robust gentleman who speaks with great eloquence about the need for transplantation. Now we have gene therapy. Yesterday I read in the news that the Japanese have taken a stem cell and they have actually created, by adding proteins, they've created an egg of that particular mouse. And they fertilize it with sperm from a mouse, and a normal mouse was born. I mean, you can see the potential as we go forward. People will be they can make their own organs for replacement as needed. And I also tell the medical students I teach, I say, you need a North Star, a GPS. And I've had the privilege to give some commencement addresses. And in those addresses, I point out, I start off, there's that dramatic pause when you're a speaker. You go up and you look around. And the medical students don't really care what you're going to say. All they can think about, they're all texting back and forth. Where's the party? Who's bringing the excitement and so on. That's all they care about. But I just stand up there for a moment, then they stop because they think, oh my God, this guy lost it. He's had some sort of senile device and he's going to forget. I saw that happen one time when I was a young speaker. I was watching a guy, came in like GQ and he pointed to that projector and I said, boy, I think it's, and I saw something come out of it and I said, oh, it's a hologram, I guess. Well, I'm going to take notes on this. Well, it wasn't a hologram. The projector was on fire. And they had to remove him from the stage. I never saw that man speak again. Completely destroyed him. That's why I have some notes, because if I get one of those things, So anyway, I just stand there and I look at him and I say, sexy. And then the people in back of me in all the robes, they start shuffling their feet. The parents are looking and they saying, what is this guy? Some sort of nut? I mean, what's he going to talk about sex today on a graduation, And I say, it's not SEXY, it's SEC-C. That's your North Star. That's what I use. When I'm alone, if I can't get help and the patient's in severe distress, I think about SECC, science, ethics, compassion, and courage. And I add two things to that. Is this in the patient's best interest? And do I have my patient's informed consent? If I do those 6 things, I know that no matter what happens, I've done my best. And sometimes you have to do things. I mean, I was helping a surgeon. He said, lend me a hand. And this kid, ruptured spleen, routine type thing, saved the kid's life. Everything was fine. And his heart stopped. And they gave external massage. They did all this stuff. And the anesthesiologist says, we gotta pronounce him dead. He's dead. I'm sorry. And I thought to myself, how can this kid be dead? He's getting 100% oxygen. They've done everything right. He can't be dead. So I just pulled back the sheets and cut open his chest and squeezed his heart. And nothing happened. And I did it again. And the third time, his heart started beating again. And everybody was like astounded. And I said, well, I guess a miracle just happened. And he became a famous engineer, built bridges all over the world, and sends the surgeons postcards from those places. So I tell people, don't be afraid to do something if you have the background. Because what was the alternative for this kid? They already pronounced him dead. I mean, what can you say? Well, you killed the dead man? No. I mean, we talked about vampires earlier. This guy was dead. So, I mean, now he's okay. And so that's what we have to do with bureaucrats. That's what we have to do with people up there. And I tell you, when I debate the single-payer people, I always say, have you been to Great Britain? I have. I've been invited as president of the AMA to go sit in their House of Delegates and watch them. I heard the chair of the board say, their system, I'm paraphrasing, you can read about it in JAMA, I wrote about it there. Their system's being destroyed by bureaucrats, by regulations, by all these quotas. I went to Canada at their invitation, and I heard a young lady doctor go to the microphone and say, my patients are dying on waiting lists. I mean, the press may not cover that, but I did. I wrote about it, and I remind people. And finally, I think my time's up. It's a privilege to be here. God bless you and God bless America. Thank you.